The winter of 1285. A Hungarian border guard stands on newly constructed stone walls along the eastern frontier. His breath forms small clouds in the frigid air as he peers into the darkness beyond the Carpathian mountains. Then he hears a sound that chills the blood of every survivor of the events of 44 years prior. The rhythmic pounding of hooves, thousands and thousands of hooves. And above that terrifying accompaniment, a blood-curdling war cry rings out. Hurrah! 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 The Mongols have returned. The guard's hand trembles as he reaches for the signal bell. Around him, other sentries freeze, recognizing the sound. Some of them are old enough to remember. In 1241, they were children, hiding in forests and caves while their world burned. They remember the stories told by surviving parents. They remember mass graves, depopulated villages, and the years of ensuing famine. And now, decades later, standing on walls that didn't exist in their childhoods, they hear the same war cries echoing through the mountains. You might think you know how this story ends. We've all heard the tales of the Mongol conquests. We're familiar with the unstoppable hordes of Genghis Khan, sweeping across Asia like a force of nature in human form. We know of the smoldering ruins of Baghdad, where the Tigris River was rumored to have been blackened by the ink of destroyed libraries and reddened by the blood of scholars. We know of the fall of Kiev, of Russian princes crushed beneath triumphal platforms, of the terror that gripped all of Europe as these warriors from the east appeared on the horizon like a biblical plague. And if you know anything of Hungarian history, you're likely aware that in 1241, the Mongols didn't just defeat Hungary, they annihilated it. They killed approximately a quarter of the population, between 250,000 and 500,000 people. They turned the most powerful kingdom in Central Europe into smoldering ruins and scattered bones. Contemporary chroniclers described wolves and wild animals repopulating villages because no humans were left. So, when the guards heard the Mongol war cries in the winter of 1285, when they saw the banners of the Golden Horde rising again above the mountain passes, they had every reason to believe they were witnessing the end of the world for the second time in their memory. Their fathers had failed to stop the Mongols. Entire armies had been swept aside like dust in a hurricane. What chance did they have? But here's the thing. This is why this story is worth telling, worth studying, worth remembering. They were wrong. What happened in 1285 was not a repeat of 1241. It wasn't even close. In fact, it was almost the exact opposite. Because in the 44 years between these two invasions, Hungary had transformed into something the Mongols had never encountered before, something they didn't understand, something they couldn't defeat. And the story of that transformation is one of the most remarkable tales of resilience, strategic genius, and sheer stubborn determination in medieval history. It's a story of learning from catastrophic failure. It's about strategic patience and long-term planning in an era when most rulers thought in terms of months and years, not decades. It's about the courage to completely reimagine one's entire society in response to an existential threat. And it's about the moment when the unstoppable force of Mongol conquest finally met an immovable object, purpose-built to stop them. But to understand how Hungary won, we first need to understand just how catastrophically it lost the first time. We need to go back to the 11th of April 1241, to a place called Mohi, to witness what one chronicler later described as the day the Lord turned his face from Christendom. King Béla IV of Hungary was a good man. Let me make that clear from the outset, because it's easy, looking back at what happened, to assume incompetence or cowardice. He was not incompetent. He was not a coward. By most medieval standards, he was a fairly capable ruler who had consolidated royal power and maintained one of the strongest kingdoms in Central Europe. When, in 1237, he received word that a mysterious army of horsemen from the east was destroying everything in its path, he took it seriously, but only in part. He heeded the warning. He nodded in the right places. He even took some preliminary defensive measures, but I don't think he truly grasped what was coming. The warning came from a Dominican friar named Julian, who brought a letter from Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's own grandson. In it, Batu demanded that Béla unconditionally surrender his entire kingdom to the Tatar forces, or face annihilation. Béla did what any medieval king would do when faced with such an outrageous ultimatum from an unknown power thousands of miles away. He ignored it. It was, after all, understandable. Imagine being some messenger claiming to represent an empire you've never heard of and demanding total surrender. you'd probably laugh him in the face too. This was followed by two more warnings. First, in 1239, the Cumans arrived, a nomadic people fleeing for their lives, with news of horrors that seemed almost too incredible to be true. They told of cities turned to ash in days, of populations slaughtered to the last child, of an army that moved faster than any force Europe had ever seen. I gave them refuge, settling them in the steppes along the Tisa River. This decision would prove to be both prescient and problematic. The second warning came in early 1241, from Poland, which was already being invaded by a separate Mongol detachment. By then, it was too late to adequately prepare. You see, I faced a dilemma that would seem almost peculiar to modern military minds, but was very real and very serious in medieval Europe. For generations, Hungarian monarchs had maintained an absolute monopoly on castle building. Only the king could authorize the construction of stone fortifications, and those were built primarily along the western border, facing the Holy Roman Empire. Why? Because strong independent castles meant strong independent nobles, and strong independent nobles meant potential challenges to royal authority. This policy had worked brilliantly for maintaining centralized royal power, but it was also a policy that was about to doom hundreds of thousands of people. Because when the Mongols invaded Hungary in early 1241, there were virtually no fortifications to stop them or protect the population. When the Mongols invaded Hungary, they came not as a single massive army, but as 5 separate forces, each a masterpiece of coordinated strategy. The main army, possibly 50 to 60,000 strong, under the command of Batu Khan and the legendary general Subutai. It crossed the Vareki Pass in the northeast. The speed of the Mongol advance was terrifying. Contemporary European observers described it as lightning, a force of nature, not a human army. They moved faster than messengers could deliver warnings, faster than defending armies could mobilize. The Mongols traveled light. Each warrior had several horses, allowing them to switch mounts and maintain a pace that would have killed European war horses in a matter of days. I had personally overseen the construction of dense natural barriers along Hungary's eastern border. These barriers represented months of labor and significant expense. The Mongols had specialized units that cleared these paths in 3 days. 3 days to remove obstacles that took months to create. Hungarian forces, scattered across the country, tried to intercept them. Each attempt failed, and failed spectacularly. An army led by Archbishop Ugrin Sak of Kalocsa attempted to ambush a Mongol detachment. The Mongols feigned retreat. The archbishop, thinking he had achieved a great victory, ordered his heavily armored cavalry to pursue them. The Mongols led them straight into a marsh. The heavy European horses became mired in the mud and were hopelessly stuck. Mongol horse archers surrounded the trapped Hungarian forces and shot them down from a safe distance. The archbishop barely escaped. By the time I managed to assemble my main army, probably somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, my kingdom was already bleeding from 1,000 wounds. On the 10th of April, 1241, the two main forces finally clashed on the Sajo River, near the small town of Mohi. This time, the Christians had a numerical advantage. The Hungarians had the advantage of position, holding the west bank of the river, while the Mongols were on the east bank. They controlled the only significant bridge in the area. The Hungarians camped on the west bank. And that night, when a small Mongol force attempted to cross the bridge, Hungarian crossbowmen repulsed them with heavy losses. The camp erupted in jubilation. They had won. The terrifying Mongols had just been beaten by Hungarian soldiers. Wine flowed freely. Men celebrated. If you've studied military history even a little, you can probably guess what happened next. The repulse of the attack on the bridge was not a defeat for the Mongols. It was a lure. It was theater. A meticulously planned deception designed to make the Hungarians feel secure, to make them let down their guard. While the Hungarians celebrated their victory, Subutai calmly executed a plan he had likely conceived days earlier. At dawn on April 11, Batu Khan launched another assault across the bridge. This time, the attack was accompanied by something new. The Mongols had brought catapults and began hurling projectiles into the Hungarian positions. But these weren't just rocks. Contemporary accounts describe them as devices that produced a roar and fire, explosive or incendiary substances of some kind, that caused noise, smoke, and absolute terror among the defenders. But this frontal assault was merely a diversion. The real threat lay elsewhere. While the Hungarians' attention was focused entirely on the bridge, Subutai had discovered a ford several miles upstream. During the night, while the Hungarians slept after their celebration, Subutai's forces silently took up positions. Now, as Batu attacked from the front, Subutai's cavalry made an enveloping maneuver to attack the Hungarian camp from the rear. The Hungarians, realizing they were about to be surrounded, did exactly what the Mongols expected them to do. They charged out of the camp in a desperate attempt to break the ring before it could be fully closed, and that's when the trap snapped shut. That's where the Hungarians' own mistakes turned against them. The Hungarian camp was poorly organized. Tents were packed too closely together, leaving no room for maneuver. Wagons were positioned around the perimeter of the camp, which seemed like a good idea until it turned into a trap, locking thousands of soldiers into a confined space with no ability to fight effectively and no escape route. As the Mongol forces began their systematic destruction, there was no salvation. The Mongol archers, the best in the world, unleashed volley after volley into the packed mass of men. When the Hungarians finally managed to break out of the camp and tried to flee westward, the Mongols had, with foresight, left a gap in their encirclement. To the desperate Hungarians, it seemed like a miracle. They poured into this gap in an unorganized mass. Thousands of men abandoned formation, discarded their weapons. It was not mercy. It was tactical genius, based on psychological calculation, formulated by Sun Tzu centuries earlier. Build your opponent a golden bridge to retreat. The Mongols knew that cornered men fight with desperate bravery, but those offered a chance to escape will take it, and fleeing men are easy to kill. As the Hungarian army disintegrated into a panicked rout, the Mongol light cavalry pursued them for many miles. Methodically, systematically, they ran down the fleeing soldiers, shot them with their bows, and moved on to the next target. It was a slaughter conducted with industrial efficiency. By the evening of April 11, between 60,000 and 70,000 Hungarian soldiers were dead. In a single day of battle, Hungary had lost more soldiers than many medieval kingdoms could field in their entirety. Archbishop Ugrin Sak died in the carnage. Duke Koloman of Slavonia, the king's own brother, was mortally wounded. King Béla IV himself barely escaped, fleeing to Austria, while Mongol pursuit detachments chased him across his own kingdom like a wounded animal. And the Mongols had only just begun their real work. What followed would be remembered by the Hungarians simply as the devastation. The Mongol army, freed from any significant military resistance, spread across Hungary like a plague. They burned Pest, a major city on the eastern bank of the Danube. They swept across the great Hungarian plain, destroying everything with methodical thoroughness. This was not merely military destruction. The Mongols destroyed civilian infrastructure with the same care they applied to military targets. Villages were burned, farms destroyed, monasteries looted, mills demolished, bridges destroyed. They killed livestock, ruined crops, wells. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary historians estimate that approximately a quarter of Hungary's population died during and immediately after the Mongol invasion, between 250,000 and 500,000 people. Some regions were rendered almost entirely depopulated. The Great Hungarian Plain was left resembling a desert. Contemporary chroniclers described wolves and wild animals returning to villages because no humans were left. But here's what's interesting, the detail that would prove crucial 44 years later. Not every fortification fell. In fact, the few stone castles Hungary possessed withstood every Mongol assault. When the Mongols attacked Esztergom, Hungary's capital and largest city, they brought 30 siege engines, 30 catapults and trebuchets, artillery that had reduced the mighty cities of China and Persia to rubble. They pounded the stone walls with everything in their arsenal. The walls held, thick and well built enough to withstand the bombardment without significant damage. When the bombardment failed, the Mongols attempted a direct assault. Batu Khan himself, Genghis Khan's grandson, personally led a desperate charge against the walls. He lost 30 of his personal bodyguards in that attempt. These were elite warriors, Batur, the best of the best. Crossbowmen picked them off from the battlements. The Mongols, masters of siege warfare who had breached fortresses across Asia, could not take a single well-built stone castle in Hungary. Another fortress that held was the Croatian castle of Klis. The Mongols brought their siege engines and hurled stones at the walls. The stones bounced off. After several days of fruitless attacks, the Mongols withdrew and moved on. These successes were but tiny glimmers of light in an overwhelming darkness, but they offered hope nonetheless, and someone noticed. Someone learned a lesson that stone walls, properly built and defended, could stop the Mongols dead in their tracks. In March 1242, the Mongols left Hungary as suddenly as they had arrived. Batu Khan received word of the death of the Great Khan, Ogadai in Mongolia, and Mongol law of succession required all princes of the blood to return for the Kurultai, the assembly that would elect a new Khan. Batu withdrew his forces eastward, leaving behind a kingdom so devastated that its full recovery would take generations. King Béla IV returned from his refuge on the Adriatic coast to find his realm in ruins. Contemporaries described him weeping openly at the sight of his ruined capital. A chronicler, Master Roger, penned a work titled Carmen Miserabile, or The Song of Misery, detailing horrors that would sicken a modern reader. Béla could have despaired. He could have focused solely on immediate reconstruction. Many kings would have done just that. But Béla IV was about to prove himself one of the most outstanding rulers in Hungarian history, because as he surveyed the smoldering ruins of his kingdom, he wasn't just thinking about rebuilding. He was thinking about the future. He was thinking about the next invasion, because he knew with absolute certainty that the Mongols would return. And when they did, Hungary would be ready. Ready not just to resist, but to win. Before we continue the story of how Béla transformed Hungary, if you are enjoying this deep dive into medieval history and military strategy, please hit the like button. It really helps the algorithm show this content to more history enthusiasts. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Imagine you are Béla IV in the summer of 1242. You stand on the site where your capital once was. Wooden fortifications have turned to ash and charcoal. Homes are in ruins. Bodies are still being collected from the streets. Your treasury is empty. Your nobles have scattered. You have virtually no army. You have no money. You have a traumatized population, questioning if God himself has abandoned them. Most kings in history, faced with this situation, would have spent the remainder of their reign trying to get back to where things were before the disaster. Béla IV decided to build something that had never existed before. He decided to completely transform Hungarian society, to overturn centuries-old traditions, to stake everything on a gamble that most of his contemporaries would have likely considered madness. The lesson of Esztergom was blindingly obvious once you realized it. Stone walls stopped the Mongols, not wooden palisades, not earthworks, not faith or bravery, not cavalry charges, but stone. But Hungary had extremely few stone castles, perhaps a dozen of significance in the entire kingdom, and building new ones was incredibly expensive. Béla did something that must have seemed insane to his contemporaries. He abolished centuries-old Hungarian traditions. In a series of decrees, beginning in 1242 and continuing throughout his reign, he actively encouraged his nobles to build stone castles, not just allowed, but encouraged them. He offered incentives, tax breaks, and political privileges to anyone who erected proper defensive structures. Consider what this meant politically. For generations, Hungarian kings had jealously guarded their monopoly on military power. They understood that strong castles meant strong nobles, and strong nobles posed a threat to royal authority. Béla was deliberately creating potential rivals to his own power, because he understood something more fundamental. A king who rules over ashes will not rule for long. It is better to share power with strong nobles who can defend the kingdom than to maintain absolute power over a graveyard. It is better to risk future civil conflict than to guarantee present extinction. The transformation was astonishing in its scale and speed. In the first 10 years after the invasion, 44 new stone castles appeared throughout Hungary. By the end of Béla's reign in 1270, this number had nearly tripled to around 100 castles. For comparison, this is more castles built in a single generation than many European kingdoms erected over centuries. And these were not just fortifications, they were state-of-the-art defenses, incorporating all the lessons learned from the Mongol invasion. They were built on hilltops, on coastal cliffs, on any terrain that offered a natural advantage. They had thick walls, often 8 to 10 feet thick, designed to withstand bombardment. They had multiple layers of defense and supplies for prolonged sieges. Take, for example, Visegrad, built between 1246 and 1259 on a commanding hilltop overlooking the Danube Bend. Funding was provided by Béla's devoted wife, Queen Maria Lascarina. The king literally used his wife's dowry to erect this fortress. So seriously did he take the threat. The fortress blocked the river route through the mountainous terrain, making it impossible for any army to advance along the Danube without first encountering Visegrad or accounting for Buda Castle. Before 1241, Esztergom had been Hungary's capital. After the invasion, Béla shifted the center of power to Buda, largely due to its excellent defensive position on Castle Hill, overlooking the Danube. The new capital was not simply rebuilt. It was reimagined as a fortress city that could serve as a last bastion should the Mongols return. However, Béla did not stop at castles. He radically reformed Hungary's military structure. The light cavalry, which had formed the backbone of Hungarian forces before 1241, proved ineffective against the Mongols, who excelled at their own methods of warfare. Béla shifted resources towards heavy cavalry, armored knights capable of holding ground and engaging in close combat. He hired crossbowmen from Venice and other Italian city-states, and also brought in knights hospitaller and other military orders. These were not merely soldiers, but professional soldiers with years of experience. The social restructuring was equally radical. Vast swathes of Hungary had been depopulated following the Mongol invasion. Dead peasants paid no taxes, and empty land produced nothing. Béla initiated an aggressive campaign to repopulate his kingdom, offering incentives to settlers from Germany, Poland, Italy, and elsewhere in Europe. Thousands arrived, bringing with them new agricultural technologies, new crafts and skills. They founded towns and villages on lands that had been rendered desolate. Within a generation, many of the hardest-hit areas had recovered their population and productivity. Béla actively supported mining and metallurgy, understanding that economic power was the foundation of military strength. He encouraged the development of fortified towns, granting urban privileges to settlements that agreed to maintain walls and militia forces. In effect, he created a layered defense, a network of mutually supporting strongpoints designed to make life difficult for any invader. And all the while, throughout the decades of transformation, border raids from the east served as a constant reminder that this was not merely theoretical. The Mongols had not forgotten Hungary. Small detachments raided across the borders, probing defenses and testing new fortifications. They watched, they learned, and they waited. Béla's transformation program came at a cost. By granting the nobility the right to build castles and maintain private armies, he laid the groundwork for future civil conflicts. These fortified nobles became increasingly independent, increasingly inclined to challenge royal authority. The last years of Béla's reign were marked by rising tensions between the crown and the magnates. But Béla knew what he was doing. He was making a calculated compromise. He sacrificed the absolute centralized power of the Hungarian crown for something more valuable in the immediate term: survival. He was building a kingdom that could withstand another Mongol invasion, even if it meant creating power structures that might one day threaten his own descendants. When Béla IV died in 1270, after a reign of 35 years, he left behind a completely transformed kingdom. Chroniclers would call him the second founder of Hungary, placing him on par with King Stephen I, who had originally founded the Hungarian state in the year 1000. It is a deserved title. In many ways, what Béla created in the decade after 1241 was more remarkable than the original founding of the kingdom. His son, Stephen I, reigned for only 2 years, dying in 1272. The crown then passed to his grandson, Ladislaus IV. Ladislaus was only 10 years old when he became king. His mother was Cuman, one of those nomadic refugees who had fled the Mongols decades earlier and settled in Hungary. As Ladislaus grew, he increasingly identified with his Cuman heritage rather than the Hungarian Christian culture of the court. He dressed like them, lived among them, even had Cuman mistresses, neglecting his Christian wife. The Hungarian nobility and church hierarchy were aghast, and the Archbishop of Esztergom declared something of a crusade against his own king. The kingdom that Béla had so painstakingly rebuilt began to unravel due to cultural and religious conflicts. By the 1280s, Hungary was in a state of barely controlled chaos. Ladislaus clashed with the church. Nobles fought each other over territory and privilege, using the castles Béla had encouraged them to build as bases for private wars. In 1282, the Cumans themselves rebelled. Ladislaus suppressed the rebellion at Lake Hod, proving his effectiveness as a military leader when necessary, but his relationships with both the church and the nobility remained extremely strained. To outside observers, Hungary looked weak, fractured, and on the verge of collapse, and it looked like the very kind of target the Mongols usually conquered as they built their empire. It was then that the Mongols decided it was time for round two. The Mongol Empire of 1,285 was no longer the unified, monolithic colossus that Genghis Khan had forged. After the death of the Great Khan and the subsequent infighting, the empire had fragmented into four major ulus. The Golden Horde, which controlled the western steppes and Rus, effectively enjoyed autonomy under its own leadership. In 1285, the real power in the Golden Horde belonged not to the official Khan, but to a man named Nogai. Nogai was as fearsome and ambitious as his more illustrious predecessors. He had spent decades consolidating his influence through military success and political intrigue. He had campaigned from the Balkans to the Caucasus, defeated Byzantine armies, and established himself as a formidable player in Eastern European politics. And his ambitions were vast. He saw a fractured, internally conflicted Hungary, and he saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to complete the conquest begun by Batu Khan, to sweep across Central Europe, and to cement his status as a conqueror worthy of Genghis himself. The immediate pretext proved almost absurdly convenient. After Ladislaus suppressed the Cuman rebellion in 1282, many Cuman warriors chose to flee eastward rather than submit to forced Christianization. They crossed into Golden Horde territory, where they found service with Nogai. These refugees told Nogai all about Hungary's internal weaknesses, of a young king despised by his own nobles, excommunicated by his own church. They painted a picture of a land ripe for conquest. Nogai made his decision. He would finish what Batu Khan had started 44 years earlier. In late 1285, as an unusually severe winter descended upon Eastern Europe, two massive Mongol armies invaded Hungarian territory. The northern contingent, under Prince Talabuga, crossed the Carpathian passes, following roughly the same route as Batu. The southern contingent, under Nogai himself, came through Transylvania. The Mongol plan was elegantly simple. The two armies were to ravage the countryside, draw out the Hungarian forces, defeat them with their superior mobility, then link up at Pest and crush any remaining resistance. They expected this campaign to proceed more or less as the 1241 invasion had, perhaps even faster. What Nogai and Talabuga failed to fully grasp was that they were not invading the Hungary of 1241. They were invading something fundamentally new, something that had been designed and built specifically to destroy the Mongols. The Hungarian response from the outset baffled the Mongol commanders. King Ladislaus IV did indeed muster a royal army, but it did not mass in one place awaiting a decisive battle. Instead, Hungarian forces remained dispersed. Local magnates mobilized their own forces and garrisoned their castles. Rather than seeking grand confrontations like the Mongols' predecessors, the Hungarians seemed content to let the Mongols come to them. The northern army of Talabuga was the first to discover what this meant in practice. As they advanced into Hungary, they found that every significant town was protected by stone fortifications. Every strategically important point had a castle. The fortress at Rimazombat, perched on a hill in northeastern Hungary, refused to surrender. The Mongols brought their siege engines. They hurled stones at the walls of Rimazombat. The walls held firm, built by men who understood siege warfare and designed specifically to withstand bombardment. While the Mongols were occupied with fruitless sieges, Hungarian forces constantly harassed them. Local commanders, such as Roland Borsa, Amadeus Abba, George Baksa, and Peter Izov led mobile detachments that attacked Mongol foraging parties, ambushed isolated units, cut supply lines, and then retreated to their fortified bases before the Mongols could retaliate. This was guerrilla warfare waged by forces with secure havens. Particularly effective were the Sekli, fierce Hungarian allied warriors who lived in the Carpathian frontier. They knew the terrain intimately. Every valley and pass, every forest trail and river ford. They used the mountains as an experienced fighter uses terrain in combat, turning natural features into weapons against the invaders. The fortress of Toroshk in Transylvania became a particular thorn in Talabuga's side. Defended by Sekli warriors, it withstood numerous assaults. The Mongols attacked, lost men to arrows and falling rocks, made no progress, and were forced to withdraw. Every assault was a failure. Every setback eroded morale and supplies. Meanwhile, the winter arrived, characterized by unprecedented severity. Snow, ice, and brutal cold. The Mongols had deliberately invaded in winter, calculating that frozen rivers and hard ground would facilitate their movement. But they failed to account for what winter meant in the context of sieges of well-fortified positions. Their greatest strength lay in mobility. Their entire military system was built around fast-moving cavalry, capable of covering vast distances and concentrating overwhelming force against isolated targets. But Hungary in winter, dotted with fortified strongpoints that could not be quickly bypassed or captured, completely negated this advantage. The Mongols found themselves drawn into siege operations where they had no chance of victory, wasting supplies and achieving nothing. Their mobility, their most crucial advantage, became useless when there was no room to maneuver. Every target required a lengthy siege, and the weather that winter was particularly brutal. Deep snow hampered the movement of even their hardy steppe ponies. Frozen ground meant that horses could not graze easily, requiring them to carry more fodder or take it from a countryside that had been carefully devastated. Nogai's southern army in Transylvania faced similar difficulties. They managed to capture only one significant fortification, the castle at Banfihunyad. And that success came at a heavy cost. Everywhere else, stone walls and determined defenders stopped them. Local forces, under the command of Voivode Roland Borsa, conducted a masterful defensive campaign, using the mountainous terrain to funnel Mongol movements into kill zones and orchestrate devastating ambushes. Borsa had studied the records of the 1241 invasion. He understood how the Mongols fought, so he simply did not engage them on their terms. He harassed them, ambushed them, retreated, and repeated the process. Of particular note were the Hungarian militiamen. These were not professional soldiers, but armed peasants, townsfolk, and minor nobles organized and trained for local defense. They knew their regions intimately and fought with the desperation of men defending their homes and families. More importantly, they had fortified strongpoints to retreat to under pressure. This defensive system was incredibly difficult to defeat, as it had no single point of failure. By the beginning of 1286, likely around February, Talabuga and Nogai managed to unite their forces beneath Pest. Had they managed to take the city, it might have saved the campaign. But Pest was now protected by stone walls and defended by troops who knew exactly what a Mongol victory looked like. The city did not fall, the walls held. The Mongol commanders faced a decision. They could continue the campaign, besieging impregnable fortresses, losing men and horses to constant raids, or they could cut their losses and withdraw. They chose to withdraw. It was a rational choice, but also an admission of defeat. The withdrawal, particularly Talabuga's northern route through the Carpathians, became a nightmare. The same mountain passes that had guided the Mongols into Hungary now became killing fields. Hungarian forces launched ambushes and melted away into the mountains. Winter storms caught armies stretched out along mountain roads. The careful discipline that characterized the advance dissolved into something approaching panic. The Vereki Pass, the very pass Batu Khan had triumphantly used in 1241, became Talabuga's Valley of Death. Contemporary sources describe his army being torn apart by constant attacks, with Hungarian forces picking off stragglers and supply trains. The withdrawal became a rout. The rout became a disaster. Nogai's withdrawal was better organized, but he too faced constant harassment and heavy losses. King Ladislaus IV, who had avoided decisive battle with his main army during the invasion, now pursued the retreating Mongols, maximizing their losses. The entire invasion lasted about 2 months. 2 months, compared to the year-long devastation of 1241. Some regions were raided, but the central lands remained untouched. No major city fell. The network of castles held. The population was not annihilated. The Mongols were stopped. For the first time in their westward expansion, for the first time since they had begun conquering the world under Genghis Khan, the Mongols failed to achieve their objectives and were forced to withdraw, having gained nothing of significance. The military force that had conquered, the largest land empire in human history, had just been defeated by the kingdom they had nearly destroyed 44 years earlier. The consequences reverberated far beyond Hungary. Within the Golden Horde itself, this defeat caused political upheaval. Talabuga blamed Nogai for the failure. In 1287, just 2 years after the Hungarian campaign's failure, Talabuga launched a coup and seized power. His relationship with Nogai became openly hostile. The Golden Horde descended into internal conflict that weakened it for years to come. Less than 2 years after their failure in Hungary, the Mongols made another attempt, this time invading Poland in 1287. And again, they met with failure. facing the same problems. The Poles had learned the same lessons as the Hungarians. Hungarian detachments led by George Győr and Schauer even participated in Poland's defense, sharing their experience and knowledge. After this string of failures from 1285 to 1287, the Golden Horde would never again launch major invasions into Central Europe. Various raids and border skirmishes continued for decades, but the dream of conquering Europe, of reaching the Atlantic Ocean, had died in the snows of the Carpathian Mountains and against the walls of Hungarian stone castles. By the 10th century, the situation had completely reversed. In 1345, a Hungarian army, led by Count András Lach, invaded the territory of the Golden Horde, routed the Mongol forces in open battle, and annexed a region that would subsequently become Moldavia. The hunters had become the hunted, the victims had become the victors. However, the story is not as triumphant as it might seem. Béla IV's decision in response to the Mongol threat had birthed new problems that would plague Hungary for generations. Remember all those castles? By the 1280s, these fortified magnates had become essentially independent princes in their territories. They had their own armies, sometimes comparable in size to the royal one. They had their own revenues, and they had fortresses capable of resisting royal authority indefinitely. The very system that had saved Hungary from the Mongols was tearing the kingdom apart from within. The 1285 invasion had shamefully exposed this problem. King Ladislas IV had mustered a royal army. Yes, but the real fighting was done by local forces under local commanders. Baron Roland Borsa defeated Nogai's army. Count György Baksa and his allies scattered the invaders in the north. The Szekely defended their territories. The king's contribution was minimal. The barons drew the obvious conclusion. They didn't need a king to protect them. They could protect themselves. After Ladislas IV's death in 1290 and the end of the Arpad dynasty in 1301, Hungary descended into 8 years of brutal civil war. Rival magnates and foreign pretenders fought for the throne. The kingdom that had stood united against the Mongols fractured into warring factions. There's a lesson here applicable far beyond medieval Hungary. Sometimes the solution to our most pressing problems creates new, unforeseen ones. Béla IV faced an existential threat and responded with radical transformations that saved his kingdom from destruction. But those transformations fundamentally altered the power structure, creating new instabilities. Was it worth it? Had Béla not implemented his castle-building program, Hungary might have been destroyed in 1285 as thoroughly as it had been devastated in 1241. So, yes, in terms of pure survival, the transformation was necessary and utterly successful. But the Hungary that emerged was different, more militarized, more decentralized, more feudal. Power was more fragmented, authority was more contested, unity was more fragile. Now, I want to hear your opinion. What do you think of this compromise? Do you believe Béla IV made the right choice, even knowing it would ultimately weaken royal authority and contribute to future civil wars? Could there have been another path? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear diverse perspectives on this historical dilemma. Let's step back and analyze what happened from a military and strategic perspective, because Hungary's victory in 1285 offers lessons relevant even to modern warfare. First, the value of preparation and long-term strategic thinking. Béla IV didn't just react to the Mongol invasion with short-term solutions. He anticipated the next invasion and, for nearly 3 decades, systematically prepared. This is extraordinary strategic patience. Most leaders are focused on the immediate crisis. Béla looked 40 years ahead and made decisions that would only bear fruit after his death. Second, the importance of learning from defeat. The 1241 invasion was a catastrophe, but it was also a lesson. The Hungarians learned that light cavalry was useless against Mongol horse archers. They learned that wooden fortifications were useless. They learned that trying to mass their forces for one decisive battle was suicidal. But they also learned what worked. Stone castles worked. Crossbowmen fighting from defensive positions worked. Dispersed resistance worked. Deep defense worked. And the Hungarians didn't just rebuild what they lost. They rebuilt smartly. The Mongols, in contrast, failed to learn or adapt. Returning to Hungary in 1285, they employed virtually the same tactical approach, expecting similar results. They fell victim to their own success, believing that what worked in China, Persia, and Rus would work in Hungary. Third, the power of defensive technology. The Mongols conquered empires. They defeated armies vastly superior to Hungary's, but they could not overcome well-designed stone walls defended by experienced troops. All their tactical genius, all their mobility, all the advantages that made them unstoppable, meant nothing when faced with impregnable fortifications. The Mongols needed their opponents to engage in mobile warfare. Stone castles did not do this. Stone castles simply stood, forcing the Mongols into costly and protracted sieges that played to their weaknesses. There is a broader pattern here that runs through military history. Offensive military power often captures more attention and glory, but it is defensive technologies and strategies that frequently determine the outcome. Castles in medieval Europe, trenches in World War I, anti-tank barriers in World War II. The ability to deny the attacker an easy victory is often more critical than the ability to attack effectively. Fourth, the significance of an asymmetric response. The Hungarians did not attempt to defeat the Mongols at mobile warfare. They understood they could not win at mobile warfare against the world's greatest mobile warriors. So, they didn't try. Instead, they created a defensive system that completely nullified the Mongol advantage. They forced the Mongols to fight a different kind of war, one where Mongol strengths were irrelevant and Hungarian preparations paid off. This is crucial strategic thinking, applicable far beyond medieval warfare. Too often, nations try to compete directly with their adversaries in areas where the adversary holds a clear advantage. But sometimes, the intelligent move is to completely change the nature of the competition. Fifth, the value of distributed resistance and echelon defense. The Hungarian defense in 1285 did not rely on the king or a single royal army. It relied on a network of local forces, each defending its own territory. But collectively, they created an environment in which the Mongols could not operate. If the Mongols destroyed one unit or captured one castle, it did not lead to a general collapse. There was no single point of failure. Modern military analysts would recognize this as echelon defense. You don't try to stop the enemy on one line. You create multiple layers of resistance, forcing the enemy to fight for every objective, denying them the decisive victory they seek. And finally, the importance of morale and psychological factors. The Hungarians of 1285 were not psychologically the same as those of 1241. By 1285, the Hungarians knew precisely what the Mongols were capable of, but they also knew that the Mongols could be stopped. They had built an entire kingdom on that principle. They had confidence born of preparation. The Mongols approached the invasion with overconfidence born of too many easy victories. They had shown insufficient respect for their opponent. This overconfidence led to strategic and tactical blunders. I want to focus on Béla IV because, I believe, he is one of the most underrated figures in medieval history. His achievements deserve to stand alongside those of well-known statesmen like Alfred the Great or William the Conqueror. When Béla returned to Hungary in May 1242, he was already in his 50s, considered advanced age by medieval standards. He had just witnessed the destruction of his kingdom in the most catastrophic military defeat in Hungarian history. He had fled across Europe, lost family members and nobles, and seen the work of his life destroyed. He had every reason to simply focus on survival, to rebuild what had been lost, and to hope for a peaceful end to his reign. Instead, he embarked on one of the most ambitious state-building projects in medieval European history. The castle-building program alone was monumental. 44 castles in 10 years, nearly 100 by the end of his reign. This was not just construction. It was a complete reorganization of Hungarian society and economy. Every castle required quarrying stone, transporting materials to hilltops, hiring skilled masons, and organizing thousands of laborers. It was a massive engineering feat, logistics that would challenge modern nations. And Béla accomplished this through sheer force of will. But he didn't just build castles. He rebuilt the entire administrative structure, reformed the army, attracted thousands of settlers, promoted mining, developed cities, reformed the currency, and engaged in diplomatic efforts. He preserved Hungary's position as a significant Central European power. This man deserves to be counted among the great statesmen of history. What he accomplished in 28 years is comparable to the deeds of more famous figures who succeeded in far more favorable circumstances. However, because Hungarian history does not receive the same attention in English language education as Western European history, Béla IV remains largely unknown outside of Hungary and Central Europe. This is a clear failing of our educational system. Frankly, I think it's a disgrace. American students who study the detailed histories of English monarchs, whose achievements pale in comparison, should also be introduced to the Hungarian king who took a devastated realm and transformed it into a nation that stopped the Prussian 2000-Mongol advance into Europe, and the chroniclers hailed him as the second founder of Hungary, equating his achievements with those of Saint Stephen I, who had created the kingdom in the year 1000. This is entirely appropriate. In some ways, what Béla accomplished was even more impressive than the original formation of the state, because he had to rebuild from ruins, while under constant threat. When Béla died in 1270, he left behind a completely transformed kingdom. The network of fortifications served Hungary for centuries. Cities grew into major urban centers. Settlers contributed for generations. But perhaps most importantly, he left a legacy of resilience, demonstrating that catastrophic defeat does not necessarily mean ultimate subjugation. He proved that strategic thinking and preparation can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. This legacy is worthy of remembrance, because the lesson is not just about medieval warfare, it's about human resilience, the power of long-term planning, and the possibility of transformation even after the greatest of disasters. So, we come to the end of our story, and I want to bring it full circle by returning to that guard on the walls in 1285, hearing the Mongol war cries echo through the mountains, seeing the banners of the Golden Horde rise above the passes, watching the horizon darken with approaching horsemen. But the story did not repeat itself, because in the period between 1241 and 1285, everything had changed in ways the Mongols could not comprehend until it was too late. The Mongols came to Hungary expecting to find the same vulnerable kingdom they had destroyed 44 years earlier. They expected to see wooden palisades that could be burned, open plains where their cavalry could maneuver, and armies that would mass for decisive battles they could win through superior mobility. Instead, they found a network of stone fortifications they could not breach, a dispersed defensive system they could not overcome with mobility, a population that knew exactly how to counter them, and which had spent 4 decades preparing for this moment. The 1285 invasion lasted 2 months and yielded no strategic gains. No major city fell to a Mongol assault. No decisive battles destroyed Hungarian military power. As they retreated, Hungarian forces pursued them to the very border, turning their withdrawal into a running battle that significantly reduced Talabuga's northern army. The catastrophe at the Vareki Pass was a fitting end to the Great Khan's triumph. The same place, the same mountain pass, but opposite outcomes, separated by 44 years of transformation. In 1241, Batu crossed the Vareki at the head of a victorious army. In 1286, Talabuga retreated across the same pass with the remnants of a broken army. For the Mongols, 1285 marked the beginning of the end of their westward expansion. They would never again launch major invasions into Central Europe. The mystique of Mongol invincibility had been shattered, broken against the walls of Hungarian castles. For Hungary, it was a vindication of Béla IV's foresight, but it also marked the beginning of new challenges. The strengthened nobility would spend the next few decades tearing the country apart with civil wars. The Arpad dynasty died out in 1301, followed by 8 years of civil war. This is the nature of historical victories. They are never clean. They always come with costs that are not apparent at the moment of triumph. The Hungary that defeated the Mongols in 1285 was not the Hungary of 1240. It was more militarized, more decentralized, more fractured, but they were alive to meet those challenges. The population had not been annihilated in another genocidal war. The kingdom had not been destroyed and wiped off the map. Hungary's culture and identity remained intact, and when it comes to confronting the Mongol Empire at its peak, survival is victory. The broader lesson here extends far beyond the specifics of 13th century warfare. It is about resilience and adaptation in the face of catastrophic threats. Hungary's worst disaster became the catalyst for a transformation that ultimately saved the kingdom, and the survivors of 1241 could have despaired, could have assumed that resistance was futile, that the Mongols were too strong to defeat. Instead, they analyzed what had happened with brutal honesty. They identified effective and ineffective methods, systematically eliminating all weaknesses. The society was utterly rebuilt on lessons learned in fire and blood, and when the time of reckoning came, those lessons yielded total victory. This applies not only to medieval warfare or military history, whether it's personal setbacks, organizational challenges, or national crises, the pattern remains the same. Defeat can be instructive, if approached with honesty and thoroughness. Catastrophe can be the starting point for transformation, if you are willing to make fundamental changes and long-term preparations. The question is one of vision for what needs to be done, the will to execute it, even in difficult, costly moments, and the patience to follow strategies that may only bear fruit decades later. Béla IV had that vision, will, and patience. The Hungarian nobles building castles and training militias possessed that commitment to a defensive strategy that took decades to implement. The soldiers holding the walls in 1285 had the courage born of preparation and the confidence in the efficacy of their defensive system, and thanks to all of them, to their collective efforts over 2 generations. When the Mongols returned expecting an easy victory, they instead received a harsh lesson that echoed through the centuries. Some defeats remain defeats, but some allow one to rise stronger than before. In 1241, Hungary learned what destruction looked like in its most complete and terrifying form. In 1285, they taught the Mongols a lesson in what determination, preparation, and what happens when an entire society dedicates itself to resisting a specific threat. The unstoppable force finally met an immovable object, and for the first time in the history of the Mongol Empire since the unification of the tribes by Genghis Khan, it was the force that broke. Think about that for a moment. The Mongols had conquered territories from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. They had overcome every major power they encountered. Chinese dynasties fell before them. Islamic caliphates crumbled. Russian principalities submitted. And yet, here, in this relatively small kingdom in Central Europe, they met their match, not through superior cavalry or brilliant field tactics, but through something far more fundamental, the resolve of a people who refused to be victims twice. The legacy of 1285 extended far beyond Hungary's borders. Other European kingdoms took notice. They saw that the Mongols could be stopped, that the right preparation and defensive strategy could neutralize even the most formidable military machine. The lessons learned by Hungary spread throughout medieval Europe, influencing fortification design and military thinking for generations. In the most direct sense, Béla IV's vision not only saved Hungary, it transformed Europe's approach to defense and preparedness for future threats. And there is something deeply human in this story that resonates through the ages. It's not about superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It's about a community that faced annihilation, miraculously survived, and then made a conscious decision to transform itself so completely that when the threat returned, they were ready. It's about old men planting trees whose shade they will never sit in. It's about sacrifices made in the present for security in the future. It's about the refusal to accept that the past determines the future. If you've watched this video this far, thank you for your interest in this deep dive into medieval military history and strategic transformation. This is precisely the kind of detailed historical analysis that doesn't always fit into typical school curricula. But I believe these stories are important. They show what humans are capable of when they are willing to learn, adapt, and pursue long-term goals. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content. We'll continue to explore these incredible historical narratives that deserve to be better known. Leave a comment letting me know your thoughts or what other historical topics you'd like to see covered in this level of detail. Did Béla IV make the right choice? Could there have been another path? What do you think about the trade-offs between centralized power and defensive capability? I read every comment and genuinely value your input. Share this video with anyone who appreciates a good story, enjoys detailed analysis, and loves tales of resilience and strategic thinking. Share it with a history professor friend who is always looking for good examples of strategic transformation. Share it with students who might be studying medieval Europe and need to understand that history isn't just about dates and kings. Help spread these stories that are barely talked about in history classes, but absolutely should be studied. And know this, the greatest power in history is not conquest, not military superiority, not the ability to destroy opponents. The most powerful driving force in history is the refusal to remain defeated, the determination to rise after a fall, the willingness to learn from disaster and become stronger. It's the manifestation of quiet courage, of building something today that will only show its value decades later. And it's the wisdom to realize that true strength lies not only in winning battles, but in shaping a system of structures that guarantees your children and grandchildren will not have to fight the same battles you did. Hungary proved this in 1285, and that lesson is relevant today. When facing personal difficulties, professional setbacks, or trying to build something lasting, remember the same principle. Learn from defeats, plan for the long term, and never accept that defeat is final. Thank you for watching. See you in the next installment.